Yeah. So I'll hit it and see what.
Perfect. Yeah.
Is it working? Mm-hmm. Oh, great.
So you're live now.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So J.P. Moreland is another philosopher, and from a philosophical point of view, they're going to contend for theism in a non-biblical way, right? So if you're having this type of debate, your contention is going to be non-biblical. Any of the biblical sort of approaches, in other words, based on theological presuppositions, which is called presuppositionalism, you're just going to argue the Bible, but you won't get very far here because they basically want to argue it on philosophical terms to create a philosophical basis for the existence of God. And you start there, which is my thing here, basically. You make a case so that the atheist at least knows you're being reasonable, you're following the laws of logic, and so it's just not going to ultimately get you anywhere, but it is a basis for getting you here. You're not going to win there's no way. So you say, what's the point of these debates anyway? Because you go on YouTube and you just type in like Christian debate and you'll see, all these people debating, and it just seems like some war, but it can be done what we call ironically, in a friendly way. Right. And usually it's for the sake of the audience. Like I did one at Marquette University, or I forget the guy had a PhD from Notre Dame or something, and I don't know what it was, but it was it's basically for the audience. They want to see if what you believe, is valid in terms of logic, reason, that type of thing. Yeah. Anyway. Let's do a few clicks here on naturalism. This is like a half hour, but I'm not going to do the half hour thing. But I just wanted to say, hey, here's Alistair McGrath. So he's an interesting guy. He is what I would say is a modern day C.S. Lewis, because they come from that same part of the world. C.S. Lewis, arguably, though, was literary. You know that, right? So his background, and he's the type of guy that would go and, this was back in the day when smoking wasn't considered to be, bad for your health. And these guys would all get cigars and go in the back room of this pub, he and J.R.R. Tolkien and these kinds, right? All these literary, like Lord of the Rings guys, right? So they'd all sit in the back room and talk about things. Well, Lewis was the guy in the room who we're not going to convince him that God exists, right? And here he becomes the greatest proponent of, and if you read his book, like Screwtape Letters is great for like spiritual warfare type of thing. It's really interesting, But then his Surprised by Joy, if you get that anywhere, a little book, really tells about how he came to know the Lord, and he didn't come to know the Lord because somebody argued him philosophically into it. It was basically, a whole set of other circumstances. But he is similar in that his conversion, his coming out of atheism, was in such a way that it put him sort of on the stage in terms of very, very well known. And that, and you get somebody like Ravi Zacharias, who at 17 was trying to commit suicide, and all kinds of issues, and his testimony is also very interesting. So Ravi didn't spin around because of some great philosophical argument, and at the end of that's why you should never feel intimidated if somebody uses big words, or if somebody, in essence, God uses something that's genuine in you to convince somebody. And you'd be absolutely shocked at what convinces most people, and it's not a clever argument. So I know these arguments, and I've had these debates with people. For the most part, it's not to convince this person over here, but just to demonstrate to somebody who might be struggling, out here, just to know. I thought Christianity was just something people believe with no evidence, and they just hope for the best and reject science and all that. And then when they find, I've had students at SUNY follow me down the hall and run up to me and say, like, dude, you just blew my mind. Not because it was a clever argument, but just because I never knew you could talk about Christianity that way. They just thought it was a bunch of people that had blind faith, went into churches and stuff like that. So just to encourage you, you could really have a great impact without being able to answer every single question everybody has. So just to recap naturalism a little bit, then to put a cat lid on it, and then go to pantheism. So we had these. I'm on the wrong. Let me get on the switch to the other thing. So we had these three world views. If we just draw them like that, so you have four things, and then you say like the material, the material. And here, I'll just put little g and big G here just for the sake of argument. Let's say we have these three worldviews, and this is naturalism, this is theism, and this is maybe pantheism, or we'll call it monism, and this we'll call atheism, like that. And so you then can extrapolate or take from this your model of source, sender, which is you, the communicator, and then the message. And then over here, we have the respondent or the recipient, the one catching the ball that you're sending, the ball being the message, here. And then you have this feedback loop that's going to then back at you. So you're sending the message, going to come back at you. So we had words like what? Encode and decode. It's really pretty self-evident. If you didn't know any of those words and somebody said, hey, could you break down like a model how two people communicate, you'd come up with that. You didn't need a course to figure that out, but because it's just intuitive, it does make sense. So you have three things going on. You have a person, and then something that is being conveyed between them, and an exchange then of sort of information. I get it, I don't get it. And you can generally tell, by somebody's facial expressions or something that they're struggling like that. Now, if we add to this word noise, and we get what that means, that could just be somebody's not feeling well that day, somebody's tired. It could be actual noise like this, literally, it could be figurative, but literally. It could be you're standing out in a parking lot and whatever. These are all the things you take into account when encoding and maybe not so much encoding, but you take into account with the feedback. So pretty simple, but then if we start making it more complex, and we add something like, like worldview, and worldview is going to be that, the lens that somebody's going to see the world through. And if that is going to, I'll just use this word inform. It informs. When I use the word inform, I mean it like let's say you were doing a research paper and you were given a topic and you want to inform your research by certain sources. It'd be sort of like, which people do you want to gather in the room and listen to that you're going to write down and use for sources? Or in the sense of going into a library, which books do you want to use to select to inform? So contributes to. So the worldview is going to, kind of contribute to how somebody encodes and decodes. And then we also add this idea of culture. This is just so far, what we're looking at, right? And then we from culture, we had like cultural distance, that. So we were saying, there's a whole bunch of things in a culture, and depending on, how those are, Hesselgrave has his scales, and then Meyer has her thing. And so however you're measuring, the distance between, all of that comes into play here. Now, if we add to that worldview and we say, well, is it Eastern? Is it Western? It really doesn't have to do with religion as it has to do with, sort of cognitive approaches. So Eastern is going to be like, and we'll do this, next week, but Eastern is more concrete, Western is more abstract. How do you know this? Okay, so say last Friday, if you were in, I don't even know who was in chapel or not, but if you're in chapel, right, instead of talking about Elijah, so there's two ways you can approach that. I approached it Eastern. I did Eastern, not Western. So what would be the difference? If I did Western, I'd be telling you something about the climate, something about the culture, I'd be giving you all those details. I'd be theorizing based on a bunch of details, but instead, I'm talking more experientially. What was Elijah's experience, in that narrative? So, but people tend to process information that way. And in the West, we're always dealing with endless abstraction. We're there at that level of theorizing. Give me more data. Let me see, how I draw conclusions from that. But in the East, they're more interested in the actual person, the actual thing itself, like the essence of something, rather than its physical properties or whatever. And you'll find this with people. I find that in myself. And now there are portions of Scripture that lend itself to Western thought, like Paul was heavily influenced by Greek type of philosophical things, and he tended to structure his epistles more from the Western side. But blah blah blah. So just saying, all of these things are going to then be part of this system. So there's quite a bit of stuff going on. Now, when you think of someone then who comes from from this point of view right here, from the point of view of naturalism, let's see if this one works. So let's say you're coming from this point of view of naturalism, where all reality exists can be best investigated through the scientific method. All that exists is just what you can see, feel, taste, touch, observe, and draw theories from hypotheses, which then becomes theories, which then becomes after you do multiple tests and try to replicate the experiment, blah, 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 right? So that's this. How would you encode a Christian message or a particular gospel theme to this respondent who is of this worldview? How would you encode it? And, so you're taking into account then someone who, if you keep talking about God, 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 conceptually, they're going to need to know, not that they're going to agree with you or not, but they are going to need to know how is it that you want me to think about this. Let's just take God, for example. If you're talking to an atheist and you're just using this word God, well, just use this and then we'll go on. And you're using the word God, and this person is not, you're not trying to convince them at this point that God exists. That's not your whole thing. But you're just mentioning God in your conversation. How do you want them to understand that term? So what are you going to say? Like, what's your definition of God? If say, I don't understand, you keep mentioning God, but what do you mean when you say that? That's not that's an actual question for you.
We're talking about God or explaining who He is?
Yeah, right. So somebody just said to you,
okay.
I've heard you keep talking about God. They might have some idea about it, but how would you unpack God for them?
Well,
just off the cuff.
God is an eternal being who is not affected by the things of this world. He is
That's a good, no, that's just what you said so far. Okay, so that's fair enough. Because you're saying, like, anybody want to add to that? And by the way, it isn't going to, like, stop there.
Right.
And so that's fine, just like right there. So now you've left the door open. You know, let's talk about this if you want. Right? So, I mean, that's a great start. Anybody else? What are you going to say? Somebody says, who's God? It's crickets at a Bible school, right? We had to put this on Facebook.
Yeah.
We stumped them with the question, who is God? No. You know why? Because you never asked that.
Well, an all-knowing being.
You know, in your, but who is God?
The Alpha and Omega, first and last.
That's,
In the end, just the creator is the sustainer.
who is God?
He's love.
I have no answer.
According to what?
According to you,
Yeah.
because you're using the word.
According to my own perspective of God?
Yes, exactly. According to the person using the term. So let's say that's you, using the term God, and somebody just says, well, who's God?
The supernatural being.
Okay, right? So we got eternal. Supernatural's that's a good starter too.
Omniscient.
Because you're naming attributes of God, right? You're naming attributes. So there are two categories. Let's test your theology. So let's say when you're talking about God or theology proper, when you're talking about God, there are two categories of God's attributes. Does anybody remember those? So there's what's called incommunicable attributes and communicable attributes. Communicable attributes would be like, God is love, and I can love. There's some things I can do to a lesser degree that he does. But I'm not all-knowing. And I'm not all-powerful, stuff like that. So I think these are good. These are good. Like if you're just thrown that at you and you just say, okay, yeah, he's an eternal being. He's a supernatural being. That's great. You know why? Because you just hit it right here. An atheist is going to say, no, there's only natural beings. They have no idea what is this? Explain this to me. And then it just opens the door. And you can keep talking a little bit more about that. Yeah, and with an atheist who might be thinking, so are you talking about like Marvel Comics gods, like, you know, just some individual that has superhuman powers, something? What are you talking about, right? So anyway, be prepared, because this is the world you're living in. And I'll just say, when I use this word irenic, so you have this, which means I'm going to fight you. This means, hey, let's have a friendly let's keep it friendly. Let's just have a friendly conversation. So you just don't get defensive, you know, and keep the door open. Okay, so let's just see a little bit here about, we can meet Alistair McGrath a little bit.
Hello everybody, my name is Henk de Burg. I'm a professor at the University of Sheffield and the director of the Pockroff Centre.
I had to listen to that for 10
Sheffield
years.
Cathedral to interview the Oxford theologian Alistair McGrath. Alistair, welcome to Sheffield Cathedral and the Pockroff Centre.
Thank you, it's very nice to be here.
Alistair, in this interview I want to explore your views on the relationship between science and religion, but I want to access that rather complicated topic from a more personal perspective by first of all looking at your own personal development, because you started off as a scientist and I think as a non-believer, and then you became a believer and a theologian as well. How did that development happen?
Well, when I was in high school, I loved science. It was the most wonderful thing there was. And my special love was for chemistry. And I had this view that science and religion were absolutely opposed, that they were at war with each other. And therefore, because I loved science, I just knew I could not be interested in religion at all. And that stayed the way until I won a scholarship to Oxford to study chemistry. And while beginning to study chemistry in detail, I specialized in quantum theory, which was wonderful. I began to re-examine this whole question. What exactly was the problem with religion? And I found that actually I had misunderstood the situation, that it was not as I believed it to be, that actually there were serious and interesting possibilities of interaction and dialogue and enrichment between science and theology. And so, to cut a very long story short, I moved from being an atheist, a rather aggressive atheist is what happened, to being a Christian believer. And as I pursued my science, I did a first degree in chemistry and then a doctorate in molecular biophysics, I began to realize that Christianity was so interesting, I wanted to switch to theology. And having mastered that, to try and understand this relationship between science and faith. And so really that's how I came to be where I am now.
Yeah, it's really interesting because that's the kind of the opposite of the development that I think Richard Dawkins went through. Now, I think you're primarily known as a critic of new atheism and of new atheists such as Richard Dawkins, the Oxford.
So he did, when Dawkins published The God Delusion, the reason I say read that is you'll get a non-philosophically trained scholar who takes a shot at the arguments, the main philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Dawkins is going to say that when you take religion, to use the big R, religion and faith stand opposed to science and truth. Yeah. And so he's going to put a wall. The problem that Alistair McGrath causes is that he is equally or more educated than Dawkins. He has the same credentials, and he's looking at the evidence with the same lens, but drawing a different conclusion, a theistic conclusion. This is disturbing to somebody like Dawkins. And they actually, you can YouTube McGrath and Dawkins having a conversation. And Dawkins says right out, he says, well, you got what the kids call street cred because you were just as militantly opposed to God as I am now, but only now you're changed. And so it is interesting because McGrath can speak his language, can put it in his very, very terms.
Evolutionary biologist. Dawkins is, of course, best known for his book, The God Delusion. And you've written a number of books against Dawkins.
So here's The Dawkins Delusion.
The Dawkins Delusion, and also another book called Dawkins' God. Now, Dawkins' argument, as I understand it, is that he says science is based on observation and experimentation and verification, or at least falsification. So science is really the methodical interrelating of observable, measurable phenomena. So that's why scientists use microscopes to see things that are very small and telescopes to see things that are very far away. But if you use these instruments, you don't see God. You don't see God with the naked eye. You don't see God with a microscope. You don't see God with a telescope. In fact, you don't see God, you don't observe God with any of our senses. So Dawkins says, whilst we can't prove that God does not exist, because you can't prove a negative, why should we postulate the existence of a being like
we'll
God?
hit that
Isn't
before,
that the same
before I lose everybody. Notice that assumption that because science is related to observation and your senses, things that you see, feel, taste, touch, smell, stuff like that we can measure, so on, scientific method. And how he stated the scientific method and how Dawkins states the scientific method is perfectly fine. We have no issues with it, no problems with that. We're just saying that there are limitations to what can be known through science. You can only know this first circle, the natural world. But when you go so far as to say that you can't know God through the senses. So you go back to, here's a German scholar, which is not going to be readable to most people, not because it's in German, it's been translated into English, but it's called The Idea of the Holy. And so Rudolf Otto, he makes this great case for how God, even though he is not visible to the, and sort of like accessible, immediately accessible to the senses, though human beings can acknowledge an awareness of God, sort of like what we were talking about from Romans chapter 1, but that was kind of based on what we observe about the world. But think about it, so Paul is saying that what can be known about God, his invisible qualities, basically his existence, what can be known about God is accessible in us. But Paul doesn't speak about it in terms of experience, but I think he does. Is it just a logical conclusion that people walk around and say, that is a beautiful sunset, there must be a God? Something like that. So what Otto goes a step further, and he says that there is an experience of this, but he has to create whole new language of experience. And for example, he's just used one example, and then we'll move on because this is too much information. Let's say we blacken this room, no light, so we're all sitting in here, and there's two types of fear that you'll have. Otto would say. If there was like a wild tiger that you knew was out here, and everything's dark, you can't see, you can only hear, but you're feeling this because this tiger is just beating on the door, and you're like this. Now you start to wonder, I wonder about that lock. I wonder about that door, because we have no exits. Let's say it's just a wall, no exits. So he's saying, what would you feel from that? A certain amount of fear, self-preservation. What's going to happen? Physical danger, all those sort of natural things. But then he's going to say, what if in the same room with a locked door with no way out, suddenly there was an apparition in the room? And he's going to say, that's a whole different type of experience. A whole different type of fear. So he is suggesting then that there is this kind of acknowledgement of God, even though it doesn't say, is this a benevolent God, a malevolent God? Is this a personal being? Is this something? It doesn't have any of that, but he's saying there is something innate to us. So anyway, with a naturalist, we have no issues with science. It's like, great science. Scientism, we do. But science, it's not a problem. We shouldn't use science like it's a bad word. We should just say, but there are limits. So there are limits to that understanding, or what we can know through science. Let me get out of this and get back to somewhere where I was. No, that's not where I was. That's not where I was. That's where I was. Somewhere. That's not what I want. Just hang on, let me get back here to this thing. I'm going to have to fuss with it. Okay. So when dealing with, let's say, we've talked about this a little bit, but when let's say you're dealing with someone, so by default, there's going to be a whole lot of people, even in your age group, probably more so in your age group, that are going to be naturalist or atheistic, but they may not be militantly so, like McGrath was, or like Dawkins is. You're not going to run into very many people, although you will. run into enough. So in 30 years in Poland and in other parts of the world, but especially in Poland, Poland has a very young age simply because when you wipe out most of the population in World War II, you have generally a fairly young population. Many in the universities, so I will work in the universities, and many of the universities there are just about 100% atheistic. It's a carryover from Marxism and all those years being under that worldview. When I was pastoring in Indiana, I had a young man who lived next door who was an exchange student from Poland. And so we had a youth group, and we would invite, and we had one who was from Colombia and one who was from Poland. One who was Catholic, one who was atheist. So they just had different worldviews entirely. And so this young man, he just was very fixed and rigid about what he believed, although he was a nice personality, friendly, and such. Even visited his family when I was in Poland. These types had these arguments. So when you argue with someone like that, there's a couple different ways to go. And one are what's called cosmological arguments. And this is where McGrath was going, and where McGrath got into especially quantum mechanics and quantum physics. See, what's quantum going to do? And he, with Hawking's and others, would have been convinced by what is called this point of singularity. So let's say this is the universe, the expanding universe, and a point of singularity, which means what? There was a beginning. And for scientists, this became, shocking to them. So a cosmological argument then is a category of arguments. It's based on your observations of the world. It doesn't like point to a chapter and verse in the Bible, which the atheist is going to be, I don't accept the Bible. So you talk to them in philosophical terms. Cosmological means as I see the cosmos, I draw certain conclusions from what I see. And one of these that is basically backed by science is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So if there's a point of singularity, a point in time that you can trace back, they'll call it Big Bang cosmology. And I'm not trying to be an advocate of that. I'm just trying to use their language to demonstrate that there was a beginning. If there was a beginning, then there must have been a before. If there was a beginning, there must have been a before. So what is it about the before that caused the beginning? How did this happen? And it could be why. Why did this happen? How did this happen? So the suggestion is whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's why you don't get tripped into those questions like, oh yeah, so who caused God? Right? So it's a non sequitur, it's a non-starter, because God never began to exist. So God's existence is categorically different from this. That's why we have this model where God is separate from the material world. Separate. Separate in what way? In every way. So we use words like transcendence. He's completely other than because he is the source of, like that. So then this assertion, which could be backed by people like Hawking and others, there was a beginning, but a question mark, because that's where it's going to be under attack. So some of the quantum theorists get into string theory and say something like, well, that might have been self-caused somehow, right? So they question it. But here, if it began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So it doesn't tell us whether or not that cause is God. Doesn't tell us whether the before is God, but it at least gets us to that point of acknowledging that there's an unanswered question. So we could talk about it. It's reasonable to talk about that. Some might use a moral argument, And believe me, these arguments are much more complicated than this, but I'm just hitting the high points. You can tell or know that it's possible to argue for the existence of God philosophically even without the Bible. That's why I start with a little g and argue that way. And then you'll say, well, if it's reasonable to go in that direction or to think like that, then we can switch to the bottom or the lower tier and talk from the Bible. Let's say if it raises all these questions, I wonder if there's a place where we could go and get the answers to the questions, philosophical questions that are raised. Or do we just keep spinning around in circles and ponder all the philosophical questions? So when I had it was in the wintertime, and I had the young man from Poland with me at our home in Indiana. We're walking home from youth group one night, so I just got done, I'd have the adults down here, do something with them. I'd run up in the balcony, do something with the youth. My wife was downstairs doing something with kids, and we were, just cycling around. I'm walking back with him, and fresh snow, like 8 inches of snow, just a fresh blanket of snow, and 2 tire tracks where some pickup truck had gone through. And I said, you're going to have to make, one of these days, you're going to have to make a decision, which one? You got to make a choice, which one of these? Some will use a moral argument as an intuitive kind of argument, but if God does not exist, then if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. What are objective morals and duties? All right, so from any standpoint.
It'd be like, have to go to work or go to school.
So if it's subjective, it's based on the subject, it's based on you. In other words, you determine what's moral or not.
Right.
If it's objective, then it's already predetermined. Somebody else determined it and you discover it. So if that's the case, then it's not left up to us to determine what's right or wrong, but there's an external objective reference point, a source. Whether it's just embedded in, the world as it was created, the sort of moral conscience, and that seems to make sense. If you go culture by culture by culture by culture, there are certain things that are axiomatic where this is always wrong, this is always right, where did that come from, so on. So how else could it be objective? How can people universalize morality? How can you make the assertion that murder is wrong? And that it's wrong in every kind of, how can you just assert that? Why is there innate value in human life such that it should be protected? Who gave it that value? Is it just biologically? How are we superior to any other animal on the planet? How can you demonstrate that? So on and so forth, all these things. So our argument is that there are objective moral values, that they exist, and that God then would have to exist based on, this is a very simplistic version of the argument, but that's based on the sense that it requires some objective standard. So what does that mean? If no human being can determine right or wrong for everybody else, who's left? So there must be, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to play this video, and then I won't be able to get back, but...
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed His moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in His command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good?
That's the Euthyphro, what's called the Euthyphro dilemma, which Socrates, this is, it'd be in Plato's Dialogues. Plato's Dialogues, the Euthyphro dilemma, it's attributed to Socrates, who never wrote anything, but Plato describes it. And it's basically this setup: is it good because God willed it, or God wills it because it's good? Something like that. Well, hopefully he'll play it out. Come on.
The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because He is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values.
All right, so you're going to find with people that are more atheistically oriented, they do that sort of by default, but you're going to find all kinds of inconsistencies in their thinking and how they live. For example, just moral outrage. You know, when they see something in the media that suggests injustice, whether it's a mass shooting in a school or something like that, and there's just a great moral outrage, and what they're saying is that should not be. And you say, well, based on whose value system? And so it basically comes down to, for many, this is just the collective experience of human populations over time. And this is just learned behavior over time, that it's much more preferable to preserve life than it is to take life, or to have harmony within a society. We've discovered that it's just much better not to be hostile towards each other or to threaten one another, something like that. And so the issue came up back in the 1700s with people like John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, that had what's called the social contract theory. And social contract theorists postulated the notion that any given group of people, should you have like a shortage of rations or shortage of supplies such that survival was critical, they said there's this state of nature by which they would do anything to survive. It basically conceived of human beings in a negative way, you know, right? So we get that. They will basically act out of their own self-interest, something like that. So what do we need? Then we need a certain set of laws that bind us together. How do I know I can trust you? How do I know this? How do I know this in whatever circumstances? We need a certain amount of laws to regulate this, but then we need regulators. We need people who will enforce the laws to ensure our own safety. You know, all of this was coming out of a sense that human nature, or the state of nature, is fundamentally and fatally flawed. You know, and we get that as Christians. You know, we understand that. But their reason for proposing that kind of moral philosophy was different than, let's say, a Christian worldview. You know, the idea of redemption, the idea of the new birth, the idea that but what it did was to point up the fact that why would that type of behavior be wrong? You know, why? On whose standard? Whose objective standard? And so this is a struggle for a lot of atheists. The position that you don't want to get yourself in is where this started, you know, with taking the cat out of the tree, you know, there. So we're not saying that atheists cannot be good parents, cannot have social responsibility, cannot do things that are good on the horizontal plane. You know, things that other people regard as good, that they can't positively contribute, that they can't do the right things, so on and so forth. We're not saying that. But when we talk about good objectively so, that the standard is one that God has established, why there's none good, no, not one, right? This is Romans chapter 3. We can't unring the bell. We already were born into this world, sinners by nature and by choice. We already have this polluted nature, which we can do nothing but sinful acts before God. But relative to other human beings, we'd say, sure, you can be a nice person, you can do good things. But your measure of goodness is wrong because you're measuring according to... So another approach to the moral theory is what's called this taxonomy, where you have... you have good, or what we'd call maximal good, and then we have like good here, and then various gradations of good. So we might say in a room full of people that, well, you're probably nicer than I am, or you know how that is, like when you get a bunch of people together, probably in any given situation, you'd be nicer than I would, and that's, you know, something like that. So we tend to measure it like you might be a +2, I might be a -1, or however you measure it, but it does suggest that if you use a moral category, there must be a maximum in any species, you know, like that. There must be a maximal or maximum, right? And we think this is sort of like Anselm's ontological argument, where he says, well, here's being, just the sense of existence. And so the fact that we have this kind of existence, there must be one who has maximal existence. The greatest of all possible beings cannot just be one that's conceived in the mind, but must be one that exists in reality, like this. So this is what philosophy does. It can be a snoozer, but it sort of like opens the door to other arguments. So just to finish up here with pantheism a little bit, we can at least grab atheism and naturalism because it's more Western in thinking. We can get that. The monism side, or philosophical monism, or pantheism as you might know it, can be a little bit more difficult. It still suggests, it still suggests that there is a unity to everything. Just like here, there's a unity, but this is a polar opposite. This is a unity, but everything is God. Now, we think of God as some type of particularized, even though our thinking of God is skewed. We have to be really, really careful. I could probably find heresy everywhere in the room, and it would be inadvertent. It would be like oops, I didn't realize, believe me, because it's difficult to describe God in language. And so what we end up doing is describing God in terms that we understand, that fit our mode of being. Just try to describe the Trinity, for example. It's difficult. But here you have God as being the sum total of everything. And there's at least three forms of this. Dvaita and Advaita are two opposites. And it's basically suggesting that is everything really monistic or just one, or does it exist in some dualistic sense of two parts? And already I'll start losing everybody, and understandably, because we don't think this way. The reason why we don't think this way is because, we have eyes, we experience things. If I'm looking in the room, I'm not seeing one whole entity, am I? I'm seeing individual chairs, tables, students, everything is individualized. And this is how we think. But to the Hindu, this is all just the external world of appearances, but not the world of reality. And they're not saying that you're an illusion or this is an illusion, but it's like you're looking at something. You're looking at something out there, but your vision is blocked somewhat because there's some curtain that's been put up in front of you. But there's enough light that gets through that you can sort of see it, but you can't see it clearly. And when that curtain is removed, then you can see it clearly. And so in this sense of monism, they're saying, well, you live in this world of experiences, but this isn't the real world. The real world, the essential world, is much, much deeper than that. And you have to experientially sort of connect with that essential, the essential nature of the universe, which is God, but not God in the sense, not a personal God in the sense like we think, but just what is ultimate or the absolute reality, something like that. And so there's like 6 different schools within Hinduism, and they can all look so different that you'd think there's 6 different religions just because of the way that they practice, the markings that they use, the temples, the rituals, all those things. But they all aim at the same thing. If you will do this, whatever this is, if it's bhakti, for example, then it's the devotional approach. You've got the little puja set up in your little shrine in your house, and it's through that type of devotion and regulation in life that you can maybe get this sense of enlightenment. You can get this sense of oneness and connection with the ultimate. See, all these words are strange to us in the West. And so you'd have these are like 3 different approaches. And so Hinduism, here's the danger of Hinduism. It can envelop Christianity because there are certain elements in Hinduism that are somewhat dualistic that separate the ultimate from, maybe the natural world in the same way as this. They can propose a model, although the way that they understand God relative to this is differently. It's more like this. It's almost like a dualistic 2 sides of a coin of matter and reality. So just to put up that whole communication thing again, just like with the naturalist, now it's going to take some doing to help them understand. And here's going to be the problem with pantheists, especially Hindus. So I've talked to high caste, when I've been in India, I've talked to high caste Hindus, and they're just fascinated. They all want to have a conversation because of this. Here's this preacher in town, and you're speaking to tens of thousands of people, and so they're like, yeah, we got to talk to this guy. So we all sit and talk, and we have a nice conversation. But we're using similar words, but we're talking about different things all together. Now, if you're raised in a Christian home, thank the Lord, and you've gone to Christian school, thank the Lord, and all that stuff. we're all going to be pretty simplistic about our use of terms. When we say God, we think everybody in the world just knows what that is. And describes this term in the same way. But not so here. So anyway, let's say you start this dialogue. Oh yeah, so God had a son, and his son came into the world. He says, yeah, we get that. We got that too. We got that too. So how come you just don't join us? Because we have that. We have that. So we have the Trinity, they have the Trimurti. But again, it's the same concept, but completely different. And so you'd have, like in the middle, you have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shakti, and you have Vishnu, let's say in the middle, and Vishnu. Ever heard of Krishna? Like Hare Krishna, right? So this is Vishnu, God, sending his son into the world to set things right, because things got really dark and things got really bad. So ever heard of this movie? Avatar? Or is that just going way, way back? What was that, the 90s? Avatar, right? It was like the biggest box office movie ever in history until they started the franchise again, the Star Wars franchise. So Avatar, it's the idea, an avatar is a manifestation of God in the world. Now, I could preach a Hindu gospel, we're not telling you it's Hindu, and but just speaking conceptually, and you'll think I'm preaching the Christian message. When I'll say, this God loved the world so much that he sent his son into this world, and the world was just full of darkness and immorality, and he sent his son to make everything right again. And you're thinking, oh, that's a Christian. So you see the problem in communication? When you start talking to a Hindu, they're immediately going to go to some of these avatars like Rama, like in the Ramayana, and Krishna is talked about in the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita, which is basically their myths by which they understand reality around them. So we're not even getting into all that, but all I'm doing is just saying that when you start talking, and they could be international students, not here, but when you just get out into society, out into the world, you settle into your new home with your husband or wife, and you start raising a family, and next door moves a Muslim family or a Hindu. Lots of Hindus. And so you just know that their worldview is going to be fundamentally different, and that is going to pose problems to communicating, especially with Hindus. Hinduism is this eclectic faith that pulls in basically every other belief system under its umbrella. And it goes back to probably 700 BC, something like that, and on. And you look at the different periods, and it's added this. It's syncretistic. And so it can be very, very difficult. If you're serving, in let's say India, Hindus, if you're there in maybe parts of Asia and Japan and the Far East, you're dealing with a lot of Buddhism. But Buddhism came out of Hinduism, has a lot of the same concepts, some slight philosophical variations. So we just throw that out to you without getting into a lot of the rest of this other stuff. Just hopefully it's a bit of a challenge. I had if you want to pop, I don't know that would bless your hearts very much, but if you wanted to hear a westernized Buddhist talk about Buddhism, that was in the PowerPoint. All right, we'll let you go.